Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the Pocatello League Forum, a 2021 Idaho Legislature Preview Part 2. I'm Pam Ward, League Board Director and the co-host. Harry Kaufman, League member, will be the moderator, and tonight's forum will be recorded and available later on YouTube. Recordings of this event, whether they be in person or a computer screen, may not be used without the express written approval of the League. The League will only allow audio, video of this event to be broadcast in its entirety, except by the media reporting on the event. And now, here's Terry.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Pam, for that introduction. The format for tonight will be as follows. I will introduce the panelists, and they will each have up to 4 minutes to briefly share their personal perspectives on the current legislative session. Then, during the remainder of the forum, they will answer questions that were compiled and sent to them by the League of Women Voters. Because it is not practical to take questions from so many viewers online, we will not be taking questions from the audience this evening, and viewers will be muted. However, we do encourage you to send your specific questions to our legislators. And if you open your chat box, you will find each of the legislators' emails contained in the chat box. Also, to view the speaker, you can click on the speaker view option in the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. Viewers and legislators, please refer to the chat box for notifications of the remaining response time. A long hashtag marker will appear between speakers' time allocation. So now I will introduce our panelists. First, we have Senator Jim Guthrie, Republican from District 28. He is entering his 5th term. He served 1 term in the House from 2010 to 2012. He is Vice Chair of the State Affairs Committee and also serves on Resources and Environment, as well as Commerce and Human Resources. Senator Mark Nye, Democrat from District 29, is entering his 3rd term. He served 1 term in the House from 2014 to 2016. He will be serving on the following committees: Joint Finance, Local Government and Taxation, and Resources and Environment. Is Mr. Armstrong here or? All right, it doesn't sound like.
I haven't seen him.
All right, well, if he comes, we can.
When he comes, I'll let you.
We'll let him in. Okay, so starting with Mr. Guthrie, you will each have up to 4 minutes to share your views on the issues and bills you expect to be introduced during the current legislative session. Alternatively, to share a current issue of your choosing. Mr. Guthrie, you can go first, and then Mr. Nye.
Well, thank you, and it's good to be on the, well, I should say it's okay to be on the call. I'd rather be in person, and we've all had to deal with these challenges, and I appreciate the creativity of the League to at least try to get some information out to some of those that are interested and concerned. I'll go quickly through some issues I think is going to come up, and some of them you've got questions on, so I won't go into any detail much on those, just that they are on the radar screen, and then certainly try to drill into them a little deeper on the question when we come to those. I think we will see, well, we already are seeing some legislation and constitutional amendments to limit the power of the governor, and we've already had several bills introduced along those lines, including our ability to call ourselves back into session, limiting the length of the emergency orders that the governor might issue, and getting things that would need legislative approval, such as expenditure of funds and those kind of things. And certainly we can get into that a little deeper. There's going to be a significant push to increase transportation funding, and the governor in his State of the State indicated that there'd be some one-time money spent on transportation, or at least that's what he's hoping for. And along with 80 million that I think would be ongoing. And those funds would come from a variety of sources, including a fuel tax increase, a title fee increase, and from the sales tax. Right now, there's what they call a congestion and mitigation fund, where 1% of the sales tax can go to mitigate congestion in certain areas. And that equates to about, and not to confuse 1 cent with 1%, because it's 1% of the total sales tax is about 15 to 17 million. And the total, of course, from sales tax is closer to 1.7 billion. So they're looking to increase that to 3%. And that would raise another 34 million on top of the 17. I think there's some indications that the governor wants to see the career ladder funded for education and some other education things that I think would be certainly welcome to most folks and probably perceived by some as not enough, but I think he's taking some pretty good steps in the right direction as far as helping education needs. Tax issues have been a big deal, and I think there's some questions relative to that. We've had some discussions on an interim committee I was on. We're looking at 3 things, and that's certainly not all inclusive, but the 3 things that come out of the committee is transparency legislation, where there would be a general or a catch-all website on the state level where people could go and look at budgets on the city, county, and other local taxing district level. So there was a kind of a one-stop shop. Also some cap legislation on capping the amount that budgets could increase in a year, and also some fund balance legislation that would limit the amount that local taxing districts could carry in or carry over in terms of what the right amount of reserves might be. I personally am going to bring a bill limiting the length of the session. I did this last year and it failed in committee on a 4 to 5 vote. I believe that we should end the session the end of March, the last Friday in March, unless there's certain conditions that are in play. And I'm going to see if we can't get that again. I just think that we have to set a timeline and stick by that and fit the legislation that we need to pass within that instead of running these sessions too long. I'm also going to be carrying the hemp legislation. 49 other states allow growing of industrial hemp. That's been something that we've tried to get passed for a number of years, and we're going to try it again this year. And I'm going to be the Senate sponsor on trying to get industrial hemp legislation passed. And you'll have to let me know when I'm getting close on my time. How do we deal with the surplus amount? As you know, there's a considerable amount of surplus, and
Thank you.
that's it. Okay.
Mr. Nye?
Good evening, and thanks for the league for getting us together. Am I coming through okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
I really appreciate the league, as you know, and I looked up, and next month you'll pass your 101st anniversary. You know, last year was a really big year, but 101 is quite a deal. And I guess it was founded in Chicago. I didn't realize that either. So congratulations to the league for your work and bringing this to the fore. I hope Representative Armstrong can come in, because I'd like to hear from him what happened recently. One of the members on the representative side is paralyzed from the waist down and has lung problems, and asked permission to stay in her office there in Boise, but participate and vote by Zoom. And the majority party said no. There's a lawsuit about it, but it's really important I'd like to hear the ins and outs from Representative Armstrong, who was there. Didn't come to our Senate side, but she's a wonderful representative. She lives up in Blaine County in Haley. So, but the issues I see are 3 or 4. Number one is COVID right now. We're trying to get the vaccines out and get things going. And in the Senate itself, I would say, I don't know what, Jim, what you think, but, or Senator, we could do more with masking and social distancing. On the masking, there's about 28 Republican senators, and I would say only 3 or 4 really wear masks on the floor. There's some distance there, so hopefully we're okay. So COVID to me is very important right now. And tomorrow, I'm concerned about what the protest or the protesters might do when they come to the State House. We got an update today from the state police. They're hoping it'll be fine. We've got extra police protection. But when we're in session, we're down on the Senate floor and the gallery is up around us. And we're kind of like sitting ducks. In August, there was a guy up in the gallery with a rifle looking down at us. He wasn't pointing it or anything, but it makes you, we didn't get this job to go into a war zone, just to do our job, and hopefully things will be fine. So the third thing, as was mentioned, is the control involving the governor, and we get into that more. And the last is the budget and trying to help education and make things right. We got a little surplus, which makes things harder, but I look forward to answering questions or covering the ones that you all gave to us. Thanks.
Just as a reminder, I just want to again mention that the timer is in the chat box. So if you, to give you warning as to how your time is going, senators. So if you click on the chat box, you will see the timer. So now
And then hang on, Terry. Randy is in the waiting room. Hopefully, I can let him in here.
okay.
Or did you let him in? I think maybe Pam let him in. He's no longer in the waiting room. Ah, that's funny. Okay.
Not there.
No.
Okay. All right. So now we will start with the questions, and each of you will have 2 minutes to answer each question. So again, please be mindful of the timer cues in the chat box. And we're going to rotate through the panelists, taking turns. We will start with you, Mr. Guthrie, and if Mr. Armstrong comes, we will make adjustments. So the first question is about COVID-19. 2 legislators who are at high risk for COVID were recently denied permission to use remote participation in the legislature. Republicans voted against this accommodation, failing to acknowledge CDC recommendations as well as those of Governor Little. How will you ensure the medical well-being of observers and all the legislators that serve our great state?
Well, just as a clarification, the Senate didn't actually vote on that process. I didn't realize the House had, but regardless, apparently they've decided not to acknowledge that request. Over on the Senate side, of course, we don't have as many, and quite frankly, the Capitol is like a ghost town up here. There's not the usual traffic that you see, and certainly the social distancing. We've got it so that if a committee room or if a chairman's suite or a individual legislator's office, if they want to request a mask, that they're doing that. And so I think we're trying to be respectful of those that are concerned about it and make sure the masks are worn in those areas where the requests are made. Again, on the Senate floor, we don't have as much of a problem with the social distancing because we're spaced out a little more. And then in the committees, there's an extension on what would be the dais for the committee members, where we have some that's actually down on the floor on temporary. That's an effort as well, and as well as a lot of remote testimony by Zoom from different people. And there's also spillover rooms where they can go to, so they can maintain that distance from one another.
Mr. Nye?
Thank you. I have a little different view. Ada County, Boise, has the same mask requirements as the city of Pocatello does. And that is ignored at the State House being a separate governmental unit, and the legislature can make up its own rules. And it has declined to require masks. It encourages them. And as has been mentioned, there's a good attempt at social distancing, but that's just when you're sitting, not moving around and getting together. So I think we should try to do like Pocatello does and do it right. Yesterday, or the day before yesterday, we heard that the chairman of the health committee on the House side, Representative Wood from Burley, has not come. He's an MD from Burley, and he's not come to this session since it began a week ago. He's not sick, he's just sort of staying out of the, I guess, the contact area. And so yesterday, or attaché came down with COVID. They're on the floor with us, or in one of the committee rooms. Another senator, Senator Rice, correct me on this, Jim, if you would, but he told me that he had the COVID and got over it. So we're there to do our job and try to do it well. And so keep our fingers crossed.
All right.
I
Next
think,
question.
like I said, let's do it like Pocatello does. Excuse me.
Oh, looks like Mr. Armstrong is here. I will go ahead now and introduce Representative Randy Armstrong, and then we'll continue with the questions. Mr. Armstrong is a Republican from District 28, House Seat A. He will be serving his third term. He is Vice Chair of State Affairs and also serves on Environmental, Energy, and Technology, as well as the Business Committee. Mr. Armstrong, we can go ahead. We were just on the second question, or the first question, so I will read it to you and you can go ahead and reply. 2 legislators who are at high risk for COVID were recently denied permission to use remote participation in the legislature. Republicans voted against this accommodation, failing to acknowledge CDC recommendations as well as those of Governor Little. The medical well-being of observers and all the legislators that serve our great state.
He may have to click on unmute on his lower left in the picture.
Sorry,
Hello.
just to clarify that situation, those 2 legislators were offered accommodations and they were turned down by the minority caucus. And I think we've convinced them. We gave them 2 separate offices that were at their private entrance. They wanted a door. We found 2 offices with a door. They wanted the windows to be able to open, which is unusual, but we found 2 offices that the windows opened, and so they've got all the everything that they've wanted and requested. And so I think that problem for those 2 legislators has been solved. And the vote was to not change the rules. They were just concerned that once you open it up for people to vote remotely, nobody's going to show up, and they want people to debate in a public forum. They want people to present their bills in a public forum, and so they didn't want that to be kind of turned into a circus. So that was why that vote was. It hopefully didn't reflect poorly against those 2 people, or they were trying to not accommodate them, because they were accommodated. But as far as providing for the safety, I think everyone has a mask in the state, and use it if they feel they need a mask. And mask, which is most of the people that are at the legislature, they don't wear one. So I think the mask, everyone tells me how the mask works.
Thank you.
So there you go.
Mr. Armstrong, just to let you know, if you look in your chat box, that's where we have the timing cues as you answer.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Sorry, I didn't say that before. Anyway, that's how you can tell how your time's going.
And where is that?
If you click on chat, which should be across the bottom of your Zoom screen.
I don't see it, but I'll if you just let me know, I'll stop. Sorry about that.
All right. Next question. We'll start with Mr. Nye and go then to Mr. Armstrong and Mr. Guthrie. And this one's on Medicaid expansion. Medicaid expansion has helped thousands of Idahoans gain medical coverage. It has supported rural hospitals and healthcare providers giving services to underserved populations. how would you justify cutting Medicaid expansion?
I wouldn't. The expectation was that the cost would be lower, but we have more people signed up. And I think the medical costs have gone up some. But we also have more funds or revenues that came in this year. So far, we're sitting on an extra $500 million, over $500 million. And I think the extra cost is sort of a front end cost, and we'll save it at the end. So keep in mind, by the way, somebody else pays 90% of the cost. It's Uncle Sam. It's a 90-10 match, and we pay 10% of the cost. And had we acted sooner, before the citizens had to bring a referendum to force the legislature, had we acted sooner, the cost would have been zero. So I'm very, very hopeful that there aren't cuts in service or in benefits. Thank you.
Mr. Guthrie?
Oh, you're going to me next? Okay. As far as the Medicaid expansion costs, my position is consistent with the governor's, and I think he said that he's not looking to cut that, and I'm not either. I think one thing he is looking at that I tend to agree with is the counties to come to the table with about $12.5 million. If you remember, the indigent fund that the counties have has saved a lot of money for the counties because they no longer have to pay for some of those indigent costs out of their indigent fund. So we'll see what happens, but I don't sense that he wants to cut that funding, and I don't either at this point. It was approved by the voters, and I think it's just the dynamics of how we fund it going forward and what includes some kind of local match from the counties. Thank you.
Mr. Armstrong?
Thank you. I agree with what Senator Guthrie said, which is doesn't appear that there's any movement to do anything with the Medicaid. Haven't heard anyone talking about it. There's a lot of issues that they are talking about, but that isn't one. I don't see any movement in that direction, especially in this term. I was very clear about how I felt about it, and what I said is happening, which is it's going to cost significantly higher than anyone ever expected. But it's done, and the voters have spoken, and I don't intend to do anything about it.
All right, we'll go to the next question. Mr. Armstrong, you could take this one first, then Mr. Guthrie, and then Mr. Nye. This one's on climate. The U.S. League of Women Voters has adopted a position on climate change that includes the following statements. The League is calling for prompt action to cut this country's greenhouse gas emissions and invest in a clean energy economy. State and local leagues and individual league members have a critical role to play in helping to limit future climate change and protect the planet. How will you address the adverse effects of climate change on Idaho's businesses and economy?
I don't think the climate change is an issue that's going to be really addressed this time. I just think that if you look at worldwide, they say it's a worldwide problem. The United States is such a tiny fraction of that worldwide problem, and Idaho is such a tiny fraction of the United States situation that I don't see what little bit that Idaho could do would have any effect. And if we're significantly negatively impacting our economy or the businesses of Idaho, I think that would be really wrong-headed to do anything to mess that up.
Mr. Guthrie?
Yeah, let me just run through your bullet points and I'll offer some thoughts. The past 10 years, farmers and ranchers have experiencing increasing wildfires. There's an effort to thin the threat. You've heard that term used before. And if I could just share with you some statistics and why it's frustrating, 80% of the timberland in Idaho is federally owned, 14% by private lands and 6% by state. But when you look at the harvest that's done, even though 80% is federal land, only 13% of the timber comes from federal land because the restrictions are so tight, we can't harvest that timber. That's one of the main things we need to work on, is getting where we can use that resource and thin the threat and decrease the chance of wildfires. On the drought, the recharge projects that we've been doing and putting money into will help augment our water supplies. And also along with that, that will help in terms of flows, streams for fish and everything else, as we have that recharge efforts that go to help with our water situation and recharge the aquifer. There's also been water agreements between surface and groundwater to mitigate and also to curtail use so that we conserve water. Let's go down to a little bit more on the salmon and steelhead. There's an issue up here, it's called the second fill law, and it's hard to explain everything in such a short time. But in a nutshell, what it is that the Army Corps of Engineers requires water to be released ahead of time in anticipation of runoff or a flood. Well, sometimes that happens in February or whatever, and then they don't have any opportunity to fill that back up for irrigation, things like that. And so that water just goes and is wasted. Is that time? Anyway, I didn't hear, I don't have my clock, doesn't work either, it doesn't seem to. And so, and you look at Idaho Power, which is an industry, and the things they're doing and the requirements they have to meet for water temperatures in their reservoirs. And so a lot is being done.
Mr. Nye?
Well, thanks for the question, Terry. On climate change, I totally endorse and accept the league's position without hesitation. And you touched on it in the beginning. But don't hold your breath in Idaho. To a large extent, they're not necessarily just in the legislature, but the public in Idaho, a lot of them feel like we don't have a problem. It's not real, that the climate is sort of fake news. Some feel that about the vaccine. Some feel that about the masks, or that the COVID is a hoax. And I think in Idaho, we try to do our best, but we're not doing much of anything. I think with the new administration in Washington, D.C., maybe we get back to reducing the carbon dioxide emissions from cars, and we're going electric. So I guess we're going to touch on wind and solar in the green building, but like I said, I think your position with the league is right on. Thanks.
All right, next question is on education. We'll go first to Mr. Guthrie, then Mr. Nye, and then Mr. Armstrong. Governor Little is planning to reinstate some of the recent funding cuts due to COVID and use a small amount of the budget surplus for funding education. How do you plan to support education funding, which has been chronically underfunded for decades?
Well, and appreciate the question. And actually, the last several years, the state has stepped up considerably. And while it still may be lacking, there's been a considerable effort to fund education. And I know Governor Little is advocating for implementing the career ladder, and it remains one of his top priorities, and I'm certainly supportive of that. There's also a number of programs in terms of advanced opportunities that he wants to put more money into. He's going to recommend $10.6 million to cover the rising costs of health insurance for teachers in the school districts. There's also $1.2 million for substance abuse and mental health services. And there's just a variety of things that they're doing to try to help with the school safety and security, given the times we're in. Career and technical education apprenticeship grants that he's advocating. And so I think there's also a public education stabilization fund transfer that he's recommending, a one-time transfer of $31 million into that fund. So granted, there's always more we can do, and it is such an important thing that we step up to the plate on, but I think the legislature has done a better job, particularly in the last half dozen years or so.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Guthrie. Just a note, if you're having trouble finding your chat box, You can click on, there's 3 dots at the bottom of your screen in the black area. And if you click on those 3 dots, you may be able to find the chat box there.
I can find the chat box. It just doesn't, the clock doesn't do anything. It doesn't, for me, it's not doing anything.
Okay, well, we'll just have to use
It's,
verbal.
it's not that there's a clock, it's that our timer, Samantha, is writing into the chat, 1 minute left, 30 seconds left, and then the word stop. So just be looking for those words to tell you where you are.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're, Mr. Nye, I believe you were next.
I think we got to invest a lot more in education, and we've been slipping on it. In fact, I think President Satterley there at ISU commented recently, in the last 20 years or so, as you noted, the support for higher education, I know, has gone down significantly, maybe 25%. Historically, the state provided support for higher ed where they underwrote maybe 75% of the cost, and the students' tuition picked up the rest. That's now flipped. So it's sort of moving towards privatizing higher ed, where the kids or students are paying more than half of the operating cost. The senator's right. In the last couple of years, we've picked it up, but we've gone from about 10% of the budget or more for higher ed down to about 7 or 8%. 1% is $40 million. We got a $4 billion budget. So I think we need to invest significantly in our education, our youth. And matter of fact, the amount we spend per pupil is one of the lowest in the US, but lowest state in the US. So there's another dirty little secret that nobody talks about, and that is the deferred maintenance on campus and in the schools. We have 30 seconds. We've got millions of dollars in deferred maintenance on buildings on campus, not just at ISU, but at the other schools. And this is a great year to try to pick up that slack. Thank you.
Mr. Armstrong?
Thank you. I've only been in the legislature for 2 terms, and I voted for every education bill and the increase that has come with that. And it's always been my understanding that that in speaking to the education committees and everyone involved, that they were okay with the plan that was proposed by Governor Otter, which was to increase a specific significant amount every year. And if Idaho would go along with that, then everyone was happy with the level that it was going up. Now that hasn't happened this year that I've been able to see, but I am fully on board with helping education any way I can.
All right. Next question is about property taxes. And we'll start with Mr. Nye and go to Mr. Armstrong and then Mr. Guthrie. According to the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy, families who earn less pay a greater percentage of their income in property taxes. Throughout Idaho, property taxes are increasing at an unsustainable rate. In addition to hurting families, this is discouraging companies from moving to Idaho. What legislative options are available to ensure property taxes are more sustainable and equitable across all income levels?
That's a good question. There's been an interim committee on this. In fact, Senator Guthrie was a member, so he can talk about the 2 or 3 proposals that are coming up. I think you're right. Property taxes are a significant problem, especially in Bannock County. You remember there were recall efforts a year ago that because of there were 3,000 appeals in Bannock County from the property taxes, and people got their notice like the last day, so there wasn't much time to appeal. Most of property tax monies, as you know, are made up of adding up the budget of the city, county, and school district. And so one of the proposals is to try to put a lid on those expenses. I know that unfortunately, many of the people that are eligible for some of the circuit breakers and other protections don't take advantage of them. And so we need better advertising and outreach for those people. So everybody in Boise wants to cut, and the approach is to cut and put a limit on what any city can do, and they can't save any money. And so hopefully we get it resolved this time. Thanks.
Mr. Armstrong?
Thank you for the question. I agree with your description in the question completely. It's the most vile tax that was ever created, and it needs to be significantly changed or totally eliminated. Horrible tax, and it created, as you all know and you've all heard, but the moment they instituted property tax, you no longer own your property, you're a renter. It made everybody in America become renters, and that's not what the founding fathers wanted. That's not what the people who came over to America to settle the very first time. They wanted to be private property owners. That's why they left Europe. And now we're back to where the government owns all the land. And it's just, if there's one thing that if I could wave a magic wand, it would be to eliminate property taxes. It's a terrible tax.
Mr. Guthrie?
Thank you. As Senator Nye said, I was on the interim committee where we studied the property tax, and I shared a little bit in the opening remarks. And there is some interest in putting a cap on what taxing districts can raise a budget in a year. Right now, it's 3% plus growth and plus new for annexation, plus new growth and annexation. When some of these high growth areas, that equates to a lot of money. The budgets are going up, 7, 8, 9% in some of these areas. So that's been a problem, and the cap is designed to try to slow down some of that in those high growth areas where they're taking so much of an increase every year. The homeowners exemption has gotten a lot of play as far as what to do with that. Should that be raised or indexed? You have to keep in mind that the homeowners is 100,000, so you have to have a $200,000 home to take advantage of that. So if you raise the homeowners, anybody that's got less than a $200,000 home is going to get a tax increase, or because that tax will be shifted to them. The taxing districts can take the same amount, and if you give somebody a tax break, then somebody else is going to pick that up. So it'll shift to the lower, the homeowners that have the lower priced homes, and also to industry, commercial, and ag, and those kind of things. So we have to be cognizant of that. I think the circuit breaker might get addressed this year, and there may be some advantage or some enhancements to that. And again, I am personally working on something that would limit the surplus that these taxing districts can have, because some of these taxing districts have millions and millions of dollars that they've taken from the taxpayers with no identified projects in mind, and they're taking more than what they need for their budgets. And I don't feel that's correct. Obviously, a lot of them aren't. They're being responsible, but if you eliminate property tax, I guess it begs the question, what do you replace it with? And that's the $1 million question, is if you feel like you got to fund those services, what revenue source would you use?
Okay, next question. We'll start with Mr. Armstrong, then go to Mr. Guthrie, and then Mr. Nye. Redistricting. The Idaho League of Women Voters was fundamental in the adoption of a nonpartisan Idaho Redistricting Commission and is now working on the Fair Power Project to educate Idahoans about the process. What changes, if any, do you recommend relative to the makeup of the current commission or redistricting process? Mr. Armstrong?
I don't see any need to change the makeup of the redistricting committee. I think they'll be able to work it out. I just can't see. I can't see unless somebody's significantly more evil-minded than I think the average person. I don't see somebody being able to step in and manipulate the lines that's going to make a huge difference on the outcome of the election. So I'm perfectly fine with the way it's made up. I'm perfectly fine with input from whoever, and I just hope they get it done before you have to run for re-election in 2 years. It'll be interesting to see how that all plays out.
Mr. Guthrie?
Yeah, thank you. As far as the redistricting goes, one of the frustrations I've had, and I don't know as you would change a whole lot, but I do think that maybe there needs to be some more education about the process for those that are involved, because it seems like we end up in court with some of those lines that are drawn, and that takes money and time and a lot of frustration. And I think there is among some of the redistricting commission members, and maybe with pressure placed upon them by others, to gerrymander districts. And if you look at some of the districts, they've carved them out for whatever political or whatever other reasons they want to. So I think there can be some maybe additional education or oversight on how those members interact in that process. But right now it's actually pretty fair given the political dynamics. I think they're pretty evenly split with Republicans and Democrat selections on that committee. So I think the way it's configured is certainly more than fair given how the politics line up in Idaho, but there's always room for improvement.
Mr. Nye?
Right now, it's a 3-3 Republican Democrat split on the commission. I think we have to name or find new commissioners every 10 years. I would advocate for no change. 20 years ago, in my other life, I was the lawyer that went after the legislature for not redistricting according to the law or the rules, and the Supreme Court of Idaho agreed with my client, Bannock County, and other representatives, because you can't have much variation between the 35 districts that we have, in other words, population-wise. The problem is we're going to move from representing about 47,000 people per district to maybe closer to 50 or 51,000. And that'll probably mean one more district in Ada County or Canyon County or both, which will make our districts, all the rest of them, subject to variation. So hopefully we can get up to speed. And my biggest hope, we can do it quickly, and so that people know where they stand and what their boundaries are. So overall, I'd say we've got a really good system. We shouldn't change it, and just try to be a little more efficient and play by the rules. Thanks.
Okay, next question. We'll start with Mr. Guthrie, then Mr. Nye, and then Mr. Armstrong. And this is about social issues. There are a number of social issues that our communities are facing. These include, but are not limited to, mental health, suicide, housing assistance, child abuse, and foster children aging out of the system. What are your priorities in funding for important social services?
Well, that's a tough one, because they're all important issues and they're all relevant to the overall health of our communities in our state. I know that in terms of mental health, there's been some monies put into some of the efforts, one in Pocatello there to help with different things. The suicide hotline that's been established. In fact, we just seen a draft today from a senator on suicides, and it's pretty consistent over the last 3 years. And the reason that was prompted is because of the COVID and the belief that suicides have went up during COVID. And at least in Idaho, in the time frame that was shown there, it doesn't seem to be the case. We continue to work with health and welfare on child abuse and foster care issues, but there's such a huge task, and it's the wheels of government turn slow anyway, but it's something that's on the minds of everyone. It's just very expensive and time consuming trying to get there and address what everybody feels is the right approach. So recognize the dilemma and the importance, but like they say, if it was easy, it would have already been solved. And certainly these are not easy issues, and I'll continue to try to work on them to the extent that I can help.
Mr. Nye?
Oh, thank you. I think one of the major issues goes back to education. We need to invest more, which will help solve many, many social issues. I want to say something just a little bit broader, and that is people need to understand, and I know the league does, and help get the word out that 95% of what we do in Boise is nonpartisan. There's not really an issue. And the ones people hear about in the press or on the news, there are always going to be 3 or 4 hot button type issues, but we go through over 300 proposals a year. And so really, it's not that partisan in Boise. Everybody really tries to do a good job. We have one of the lowest crime rates in Idaho, but we have one of the highest rates of incarceration. And part of that is people being on probation and getting pulled back into the prison system. And so we need to do more there. We need to do a lot more in mental health, I think. And there's a program we're trying to get through Eastern Idaho that will help there with extra psychiatric care and training. But back to education, I think the studies show that if someone will read to a child at age 3, a parent, even if the child doesn't understand the wording or the words, just reading to the child helps. And the studies show that by age 8, not that they just read better, but they perform better and are in less trouble later. So that's a big question. Thank you.
Mr. Armstrong?
It's this whole social issue is really a difficult one, and I think that it gets overlooked way too many times, and I just think if we ignore it as a society, but also as the legislature, that it becomes a really poor reflection on our culture. And I think it's a personal religious issue almost, in that we have a responsibility to these people. And I think we need to take that responsibility seriously, which all the people that I'm with in the legislature, I think feel that way. And it doesn't get addressed as much as it probably should, but that's an issue it would be difficult to argue that we spend too much money, or that we're neglectful of those people. I mean, it wouldn't be difficult to say we're neglectful, because we are sometimes neglectful, but I think it would be hard to argue that we should be neglectful, I guess is the way I wanted to say, because it really needs, we really need to take care of these people, and that's such a vital issue to our culture.
All right. Last question is about Governor emergency powers. Recently, some have voiced concerns about Governor Little's emergency powers in response to the COVID crisis and calling special legislative sessions. How do you plan to ensure the balance of power among government branches fulfills the requirements of the Idaho Constitution? We'll start with Mr. Nye and then go to Mr. Armstrong and then Mr. Guthrie.
I think that's a good question. There has been a lot of, people that are upset, especially from Northern Idaho, about what they think is an infringement on their rights. My current view is, of course, you got to read the actual bill that comes, but my current view is to stay the course. The current system with the separation of powers in Idaho has been in place for over 100 years, and it's worked pretty well. A vocal few, I don't think, should necessarily change what has been working. And so I don't think we have a crisis. And I don't know that a committee, a legislative group, can be called into session. And I think it's tough for a committee to handle a crisis. So I think we're doing really well with what we have. And hopefully we can get through this particular crisis and stay the course with the good system that we've always had. Thanks.
Mr. Armstrong?
I really like Senator Nye. I consider him a good friend, but we're on the total opposite end of the spectrum on this particular issue. And I think the governor's done a terrible job in managing this crisis, I don't know how big of crisis it is. I read the book, The Great Influenza, about the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, and they had people piled up along the roadway. They pick up piles of people every morning, and we are a long ways from that. They had 300 million, well, given the population was 100 million people died, but they had a third less population. That would be 300 million people nowadays. And so I for us to keep saying we're in this major pandemic, I think is an exaggeration. But I think the fact that the governor has basically ignored the Constitution throughout this, and it's not just a few people in North Idaho who are concerned about this. I would bet that if you had a vote, it would be more than 50% of the population of Idaho that are not happy with it, and not happy with all the mandates and lockdown and everything else. I just think someone needs to get him under control. And if it's going to be the legislature, I've already voted for several bills that would get his power under control. And so I just think it's been handled incredibly poorly.
Mr. Guthrie?
Thank you. And obviously, it is a big issue. In fact, most of the legislation that's been introduced is relative to that topic. I'm probably somewhere in between the two opinions that you've heard. I think that we have a situation that's an anomaly, that's a once in 2 or 3 lifetime anomaly. Outside of that, the separation of powers is probably not that far out of line. So I hope that we don't do a knee-jerk reaction to what we perceive as some mishandling of the pandemic. And quite frankly, I've had some frustrations with the way it's been handled myself, considerable frustrations, but I don't think we can have a knee-jerk reaction and take the pendulum too far. So in other words, if we're going to call ourselves into session, it needs to be for just specific crisis situations like we've just been through, and have a very high bar to allow us to do that, so that we respect the powers of the governor too. Because prior to this, I don't sense there was a lot of times, at least not in my time, if there was anything that was pressing, the governor made those calls and called us back into session. So I think it has to be specific to pandemic or crisis or extreme emergency situations. I do agree that, we had $1.25 billion worth of funding that come into the state, and the legislature did not have any role in appropriating those funds. And that gets pretty frustrating, especially when some of the programs were not what I would do. I certainly disagreed with some of those. That said, it's easy to be a Monday morning quarterback, and I think the governor, agree or disagree, is trying to do the best he can, and we'll see what happens. We still may be a ways from getting out of this, but hopefully working together with the governor, the legislature can find the best pathway forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That completes our questions. We'd like to thank our legislators and our audience for attending this evening. This forum was recorded and will be available for viewing in the next few days on the League of Women Voters Pocatello website and on YouTube. Pam will be putting up that link momentarily. Mr. Guthrie, Mr. Nye, and Mr. Armstrong, would you again enter your contact email and website so our participants can write to you with any specific question they might have? Thank you. Pam is also putting up the link to contact all the legislators. For all our participants this evening, we want to remind you that your voice matters. Please do contact our legislators with your comments and your questions. Thank you again to everyone for participating, and have a good evening.
Bye-bye, thanks.